Good morning. The last 2 weeks of Trump's erratic economic policy making has brought chaos to global markets, as everyone has witnessed. And it is therefore, unfortunately, no secret that new Trump tariffs and the ensuing trade wars dramatically increase the likelihood of a recession that would have impact on the global economy, on Wall Street, on Main Street, on New York City, and on New York City's budget. Unfortunately, there is no sign that the Adams administration is taking these issues seriously, despite their responsibility to deliver an executive budget to the City Council in just 2 weeks. And I want to flag that there are really two different issues here that we're focusing on. One is the risk of Trump budget cuts, and the fact that the Adams administration failed to show up this morning at a council hearing on the question of Trump budget cuts is of real concern. But it's the other issue that we are focusing on in this report this morning, which is that they've done nothing to reckon with the choppy financial waters that we're in, because the increased likelihood of an economic downturn or recession threatens to reduce jobs in New York City, threatens to reduce tax revenues, and to blow a hole in next year's city budget. And without proactive planning on both fronts, without decisive action to prepare for the possibility of economic downturn or recession and what that would mean in terms of lost city revenues, and without any proactive planning to prepare for budget cuts, you risk the fact that you will be totally unprepared when that downturn hits, even though we can see its risks right before our eyes. And if you fail to prepare when a downturn comes, then you're stuck with fewer choices, and you have to make far worse decisions when that happens. And that's the situation where the city winds up having to consider really dire things that you don't want to have to do anytime, but certainly not in a recession. So that is why I instructed the economists and researchers in our office to develop a report on the fiscal and economic risks facing New York City. And today we are releasing this fiscal and economic spotlight on taking Trump's tariffs seriously, exploring the fiscal and economic impacts for New York City of the situation that we find ourselves in. And I want to be clear here, forecasting is just that. Obviously, no one knows exactly what Donald Trump will do, that is for sure. And no one knows for sure what the economic and fiscal impacts will be of those potential decisions. But it is incumbent on budget planners to forecast scenarios, to figure out what might happen, to look honestly and squarely at the possibilities, and then to use your best guess and estimates to prepare your budget. So that's what we do here at the Comptroller's office, and I want to thank Executive Deputy Comptroller Francesco Brindisi and his team for preparing this. We're releasing the spotlight today, and I see you guys already have it, so it has more details, backups, and appendices than I'm going to go into in this presentation, but I want to go through its highlights with you now. We assessed basically 3 scenarios for the U.S. economy that are based on the severity and the duration of tariffs and the potential trade war. And I'm not going to go into those assumptions, but if you have questions about them, I'm happy to answer them or to ask our team to answer them afterwards. But I guess I'll basically say this. What we modeled is 3 scenarios. One where we thought we were a month ago. Basically continued economic growth without a devastating trade war caused by increase in tariffs that was the baseline prior to a month ago, and shows continued job growth. And that is what was reflected more or less in the Adams administration's preliminary budget. Unfortunately, the likelihood of an economic downturn and mild recession has grown significantly, and so that second scenario that I will also present of what we call here mild recession seems far more likely than it did a month ago, and is our best guess, unfortunately, at the most likely path. We also modeled a more severe recession in which the tariffs would stay in place longer, but we should be eyes open to its possibility as well. So first, though, let's take one step back and just understand the current moment that we're in. Yeah, I guess I'll just, before I go to the next slide, I really do just want to kind of point out the moment we're in the budget process. So the mayor has already presented the preliminary budget. There was enough information then to know that they should have taken the Trump administration into account in some ways, both budget cut risks and a wider array of economic volatility. And we said that in our preliminary budget response, which we put out in February. The council has submitted its budget response, and now by May 1st, the mayor puts out the executive budget. And one important thing here is that the mayor puts forward the revenue estimate. And that, the preliminary one comes out on May 1st. It can be adjusted in negotiations with the council for another month, but that is where you are saying, here's what we believe is likely to happen next year in revenues. And because they have not so far taken any steps to reckon with what's happening, that is why we thought this was so important to do today. I think so far the media and the public have focused on the implications of Eric Adams' policy bending the knee to Donald Trump, restoring ICE to Rikers Island, failing to protect immigrants, but just ignoring the risk of budget cuts and ignoring the likelihood of recession because he is getting a pardon is a dereliction of duty in budgeting. And we are sounding this alarm bell because by May 1st, the city needs to take the economic and fiscal conditions we're in far more seriously than it has done to date. So now, let's just take one step back to set the current moment. As of today, the Trump administration has still not fully landed on and finalized a concrete plan for its tariff scheme. As everyone knows, they proposed this sort of wild, all-over-the-map proposal with different rates for different countries, and then walked it back to a 10% increase across the board with a 145% increase on China. And now today, they've raised the possibility of an even larger increase. But we have reason to believe that, so its most recent plans average to a 27% tariff rate on foreign goods taken as a whole. And, there's reason to worry that that could go up even higher based on things they've continued to say. That, of course, creates uncertainty, even separate from what the tariff rates will actually be, if you don't know as an investor where to invest, if you don't know as a business where to grow your business. Then economic growth slows because people can't plan and make predictions. Market volatility continues to make stock and bond markets wildly volatile, with a dramatic drawdown in U.S. and global equity markets, which are down 20% from January peaks. That drawdown has accompanied a 3x spike in equity market volatility, and just left everyone, investors, business owners and managers, and consumers, with wild uncertainty about where things head. So what do? We develop three scenarios from that and say, let's take a look at what we think are the most likely ones. So we did these three scenarios, as you can see here. So scenario one is no recession. Things essentially stay as we might have imagined they would be in January. And it's worth remembering here, prior to the Trump administration coming in, we were seeing a strong economy. The city was back above private sector employment for the pre-pandemic private employment for the first time. We were finally starting to see some recovery in the commercial office market. There was a reason to be, optimistic that we would stay on a steady path of mild job growth, still too concentrated in health and human services, but mild and steady job growth. So now we have a new set of scenarios to consider. So in that most optimistic scenario, no recession, the effective tariff rate rises, and this is based on a Moody's analysis that puts it at 12.7%, but it begins rolling back quite quickly, like basically immediately. The Fed cuts rates as early as the third quarter of this year, and in this scenario, which again I believe is rosier, is more optimistic than reality, the stock market would decline only by 2% by the end of the year and then stabilize next year. So that's the most optimistic, but I think at this point, overly rosy scenario. Second scenario, which we think is the most likely, is for a mild recession. Again, you see we have that as closer to the new baseline. So for that, Moody's has the tariff rate settling still at that 12.7%, but then continuing for a longer period of time, not being rolled back. And as a result of that, there's a mild recession, which could push the Fed to tighten rates in the second quarter of 2025 to combat inflation, a stock market decline of 20% over this year, and then the rebound begins next year in 2026. And in the most pessimistic projection here, a deeper recession, the tariffs continue, and then as a result of that, the Fed tightens rates and only starts to ease them toward the end of the year. And after 2 years of tariffs, the stock market could decline in this scenario by as much as 35%. So those are the three scenarios that we modeled, and now I'm going to go through what the implications for jobs in the New York City economy would be, and then critically on tax revenues for the city as we face the budget process. Okay. So for no recession, you see moderate job growth, I have these numbers. So in the best case scenario, job growth continues into 2025, slows by year end, and tax revenues stay moderately above the financial plan. But in the mild and severe recessions, the city's economy could lose, in the mild recession, 35,000 jobs, in a severe recession, over 100,000 jobs, and potentially, in the mild recession, $4 billion and change reduction in revenues over the next 2 years, and in a severe recession, a $10 billion reduction of revenues over FY 26 and 27. Here's what that looks like on the graph. You can see, the enormous impact of the COVID recession, which took 1 million jobs away from New York City, knocking us down from 4.7 million to just above 3.7 million. As of the beginning of this year, we had finally climbed back above. And if we get no recession, we continue on that steady growth. But if we get either a mild or a deeper recession, you can see nowhere near as devastating as the COVID pandemic, but still the loss in the mild scenario of 35,000 jobs, and in the more severe scenario, 100,000 jobs. Here's how that breaks out. The biggest hit is to leisure and hospitality. That's not surprising, since tourism is what's the most recession-dependent or economy-dependent model of our element of New York City's economy in an era, because these aren't just hitting New York City, they're hitting a global economy. In a mild or serious recession, fewer people come to visit here, and they spend less money here, and there's fewer occupied hotel rooms, and less people going to Broadway shows and to restaurants. So that's the element of the economy that's most hit. And I'll note this is a percentage rather than an overall. We also have a lot more leisure and hospitality jobs than manufacturing jobs. So that's the sector that would be hit the most. We go into more details in the report about the impacts on particular economic sectors. Right? And then this is where we get to tax revenues, which is obviously what's most relevant for the city's budget. And you can see here that no recession actually is a baseline a little better than what OMB put in the preliminary budget in January. Unfortunately, The mild scenario knocks about $4 billion out of the city's projections in 26 and 27, a $4 billion hole. And I'll flag that even in the preliminary budget, there were already meaningful gaps in the 26, 27, 28 financial plans. This would make those gaps, which were on average already in those out years, about $6 billion collectively over those 2 years, $4 billion worse, and in a severe recession, $10 billion worse, and not recovering in the more serious recession until 2029. And again, those details are in the report. Go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. One bright spot, though, and one very clear takeaway from it. In all three scenarios, the city will end this year with surplus tax revenues above current budget projections. Again, as I said, the budget was looking pretty, the economy was looking pretty good through January, and because, that is going to continue. Tax revenues come in a little, behind these economic fluctuations. So we project, and the details are in the spotlight, that there will be meaningful surplus tax revenues coming in above budget projections for New York City. And what that means is this, and if you just want one clear takeaway from the report, here it is. The city should use this year's surplus revenues to make a sizable deposit in our rainy day fund now, before the end of fiscal year 25, before June 30th of this year. Back in 2022, so I just want to now take a step back and talk about the rainy day fund. In 2022, we proposed an overall target size of the city's rainy day reserves to be 16% of tax revenues. That's what would get us through an average recession without having to make devastating cuts or budget choices. Unfortunately, what we have today between the Revenue Stabilization Fund, which is the kind of proper rainy day fund where there's about $2 billion, and the Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund, which has been used as a de facto rainy day fund, that was about $5 billion. But that's just a little more than half, about 55% of that target. So the city's only currently prepared to weather about half of an average recession. And after that, we would face really devastating consequences in terms of the cuts we would have to make. So based on the forecasts in the three scenarios, our formula indicates that the city should deposit somewhere between $966 million and $1.15 billion into the rainy day fund this year, before the end of fiscal year 2025. So more or less $1 billion into the rainy day fund. And I want to be clear that that's in addition to the $1 billion that I've called for being deposited in the city's general reserve as a hedge against Trump's budget cuts. So two separate reserves. One, that rainy day fund, is for economic downturn when your revenues decline, exactly as we're projecting, unfortunately appears likely. The other, in the general reserves, is a hedge against the chance that Trump will make budget cuts in the coming months over the next year, and that the city needs some capacity to respond. And I'll just give one example here. In recent weeks, we learned that the Trump administration is considering canceling emergency housing vouchers, which were issued during the pandemic and allowed New York City and other municipalities and states around the country to grow. We added 8,000, essentially like Section 8-like housing vouchers. 8,000 low-income New York families who were in shelter or facing homelessness got a voucher that they expected that they would be able to keep, and New York City expected that they would be able to keep. Unfortunately, Trump has announced plans to cancel those. So that will be 8,000 families who lose their housing voucher and will face homelessness unless New York City does something. And so New York City's in a kind of fiscal lose-lose situation. Either we shift those to be families become homeless and they go into a homeless shelter and we still have to pay. So if you've added $1 billion to your general reserve, when that happens, you have some ability to keep those families from homelessness and cover the cost of it. And if you don't bank that money, then you don't. So two separate reserve deposits, one to hedge against recession likelihood of reduced revenues in the rainy day fund, and another $1 billion in the city's general reserve as a hedge against Trump's budget cuts. But again, unfortunately, the Adams administration not only hasn't done either of those things, they haven't said a word about the risks that we're talking about here, either the risks of the Trump budget cuts, which they refused to speak about today at the council hearing, or the risks of economic downturn and recession caused by the tariffs and trade war. This is the whole point of budget planning, is to make good decisions, to be clear-eyed about what's coming. And sometimes you can't see it. You don't know when a pandemic is about to hit you, and you don't know when a coastal storm is about to come. But boy, there is every reason to prepare for the volatility that the Trump administration is bringing to New York City's budget in the coming year. This is a strong and resilient city. We survived the economic impacts of the dot-com bubble, of 9/11, of the Great Recession, of Superstorm Sandy, and of COVID. But what's unique now is the chance we have to act proactively. And the fact that the Adams administration is failing to do so, whether for political reasons to pretend away what Trump is doing to the economy because the mayor works for Donald Trump and not for New Yorkers, or because everyone just has their head in the sand, there is no excuse for failing to attend clearly to the risks that we are facing. That's why we prepared this report, both to provide some data and to sound the alarm bell so our city can be prepared for what's coming. Thank you very much, and we'll be glad to take your questions. Yes. We try to be humble to the challenges of forecasting because we don't know what Trump will do. We can't predict exactly. But yes, I think if asked to say, what do we think of these scenarios is the most likely one based on current conditions, it is a mild recession that costs, over 35,000 jobs and $4 billion over the next 2 fiscal years.
Hi. The City Council, you may have heard, is also proposing what they call Trump-proofing the city by making investments. You mentioned the budget cuts. That's kind of what they're focused on. Have you heard about this plan? They just released it today. Health areas like health and medicine and that kind of stuff to kind of combat that side of it. Are you familiar with that? Any thoughts?
Well, so we called for this $1 billion increase in the general reserve as a protection or a hedge against Trump budget cuts, which you might call Trump-proofing, I don't know, a month or 2 ago. So I think that's a good idea, and I'm glad to hear that they're proposing that. I've proposed some other very specific things the city could do. So, for example, on healthcare, health and hospitals, which isn't shown in the city's budget because it's its own authority, it has a $4 billion budget. About $1 billion of that is federal funding. That might be put at risk if they come and say, any institution, even if you're not using federal funding for it, that provides abortions or contraception or gender-affirming care could be at risk of having its federal funds removed. So I've proposed that the city should establish an independent authority and pay for the abortion, contraception, and gender-affirming care now happening at H&H through that independent authority, because that's only about $100 million. Then you have a better chance of protecting the $1 billion and being able to keep funding H&H. So there's good steps like that that should happen. Again, I don't know if that's amongst the council's proposals, but those steps are good and should be taken. What we're talking about today is sort of the other half of the equation. If the federal government cuts funding to New York City, we need to reckon with it, whether that's healthcare, whether it's the housing vouchers I mentioned. But if the tariffs cause a recession, as seems quite reasonably likely, and then the city loses tax revenues, now you're down, another $2 billion next year and $4 billion over the next two, just to pay for the basics, right? That's not then a cut that you're getting from the federal government. That's the impact on property tax revenue, well, especially on corporate tax and sales tax, on the more volatile city taxes as detailed in the report. And that's money you need for, the city's budget to be made whole. So we're trying to look at, Trump-proofing at this moment requires both things, reckoning with the likely impacts of economic downturn and reckoning with the impacts of budget cuts. And, my recommendation is $1 billion in the general fund, in the rainy day fund, and $1 billion in the general reserve.
Okay, next question? Yeah.
Hi, WWC. My name is Tara. I'm a producer. Hi. We ran a story last night looking at a business in a Brooklyn-based clothing brand, Lafayette 148, who says they are facing possibly going out of business within the next 3 months. Most of their manufacturing is in China. They already laid off 10 employees and are looking at more layoffs. With a company like that, there might be a lot more companies like it where they're facing this kind of middle ground where they're a smaller business.
Yeah.
Really kind of being completely wiped out if nothing changes with these tariffs very soon. So what would you do, or what could the mayor the mayor do specifically to help businesses like that? Like, should there be an exception for companies who rely on the China supply chain so heavily?
So let's go back to the slide we had on the job sectors, because I didn't talk as much about the retail sector when we got to that slide, but it was third, you could see. So yes, they're one of the businesses that's in this retail trade sector they're shown as a sector that is really at risk of job losses precisely for this